Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Council Vice President Willie Lightfoot. I'm joined with many other members of City Council, as well as the mayor and members of her administration. We're here for a briefing, and we're very excited to get this information. We may not be as excited for the information, but we're excited to get the information. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Vice President Lightfoot. And I know that this is something that we've been talking about for some time. Rochester is not unique when we are seeing what we're seeing as a city when it comes down to violence. We have had 2020 has led to a record number of not only shootings, but also to the number of murders we have had this year. We are committed to working with not only the community, but also with our police command team, our Pathways to Peace team, to do what we can to try and curb the gun violence. We recognize that people are frustrated and are taking matters into their own hand. And we see a sense of lawlessness that is happening. And we want to be here to support the community, but we also recognize that we have many victims across the community that have suffered either being shot or losing a loved one this year. We're committed to solving those crimes, to getting back to community policing in a real way. These numbers are very sobering, and it's something that I've been talking about for a while now, and I'm happy to share the numbers with council, but also to share the plan that we have. And I know that the chief and her team have been working on this for some time. And so I'll turn it over to Chief Harriet Sullivan and the command staff and ask that they provide you with the information and answer any questions that you may have about what is happening on a daily basis in our city. Chief Harriet.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Also, Vice Council Lightfoot, thanks again for your time. We have a presentation for you, and involved in this, I'm going to have our Executive Deputy Chief Anderson, Deputy Chief Persons, Commander Smith, David Smith, and also Nick Bettiti, who's Director of our Business Intelligence. So what we're going to do is, Nick, I'm going to have you go ahead and guide us through this. We've got this put together in parts, so we're going to have each staff member that I mentioned explain some parts of it. So, Nick, you want to go ahead?
I'm going to try to share my screen now to see if this will come up. So, can you guys see my screen now?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, great. Okay, so as the mayor and the chief mentioned, basically what we're here to talk about. Sorry, did somebody say something? Okay, sorry. Basically what we're here to talk about is I'm going to give you a quick briefing on the current crime overview, pepper in some historical crime context. So we're all working off the same playbook here. The chief is going to go through some of her initial assessments and some observations from a department-wide standpoint that she's seen. The executive deputy chief and deputy chief of operations are going to focus on the long-term violence reduction plan, and Commander Smith is going to address our short-term operational planning. So to get started, really what I want to kind of impress upon you guys is that from a crime overview standpoint, our Part 1 crimes, those are the crimes that make up the Uniform Crime Reporting Standards that all police departments, most police departments participate in as part of the FBI's crime collection. Those are murders, rapes, robberies, aggravated assaults. Those are the 4 categories that comprise violent crimes. And burglaries, larcenies, and motor vehicle thefts. Those are the 3 categories that comprise property-related crimes. If you add those 7 together, that's what accounts for Part 1 crimes. So overall, our Part 1 crimes are up slightly, less than 1% from at this point in 2019, and pretty close to the 5-year average. However, We have had, as the mayor mentioned and the chiefs mentioned in some of her other press briefings, we have had violent crime incidents spike in 2020, primarily due to a significant increase in aggravated assaults and murders. And really what that boils down to is shootings, fatal and non-fatal shootings. They're driving our violent crime numbers. Now, the overall crime numbers are a little bit dwarfed because we've had significant reductions again in larceny-related crimes, and those have offset the violent totals. So when you look at it from a historical standpoint, you can see that we've had a pretty continual trend down in part one crime. And this is a rate, so it's adjusted for population change. So it's not a raw number count, but it's relative to the amount of people that are in Rochester since about the early 1990s. And the red dot at the corner for 2020 is where we're projected to finish based on where we are right now and what we know about historical Decembers, essentially. So you can see we're projected to be a little bit up or a little bit down from 2019. Now, when you break it down by crime type, sorry, I got to move the other view. Here we go. When you break it down by crime type in 2020, this is a pretty typical year from a crime standpoint. When you look at the amount of crime per category, generally speaking, property crime makes up a vast majority of all of our part one crime. In this case, 81% at this point in the year is compared to 19% of violent crime. And if you're looking at the kind of image on the left-hand side there, the larcenies are by far and away the biggest crime type that we have. So they really skew overall crime numbers. So a 10% change in larcenies can completely offset all of our violent related crime. And you can see compared to the other crime types, murder and rape are by far and away the smallest, which stands to reason. So factoring out the property crime and only looking at violent crime rate, you can see that we have been on a pretty steady decline since about 2006. Obviously, when you look year to year, there's some ups and downs, and that's just normal variation in the data, generally speaking. And you can see we're projected to finish this year a little bit higher than we were last year, but still down from where we were in 2005, 2006 range. Now, the big topic that is kind of always in the paper and always discussed is homicides. These are murders. These are the murder numbers since 1985, which is as far back as the UCR crime reporting tool goes. And you can see there's a lot of variation as you cross time through here. There's a lot of ups and a lot of downs. They're generally speaking a low statistical number. So there's a lot of variability in it from a year-to-year standpoint. You can see that the long-term average is about 42 homicides in a given year. And this year, right now, we're projected to be at 49. We currently have 46 homicides this year, and that compares to 29 at this time last year. We finished 2019 with 32 homicides. Not surprisingly, a lot of our murder and non-negligent manslaughter numbers this year are driven by firearm-related crime. Over 80% of all of our murders are by way of a shooting, which is pretty typical. We tend to average around 70 to 75%, so it's not out of the norm. We've had 42 incidents this year with 46 victims. And right now, 19 of those 42 cases are closed. So we've kind of whittled this really down from a large look at general crime numbers to really a focus on shooting victimization. That's what's driving our violence. That's what's driving the headlines. That's what's driving our focus as an organization, prioritizing violent crime, and specifically firearm-related violent crime. And when you look at only compared to 2019, this year across the board since about March has produced consistently elevated shooting victims. We've had some really high-profile multiple victim events, like the multiple victim shooting at Pennsylvania Street. We are fully aware of the large role that violence plays in the community, the perception of safety, and how that impacts relationships with RPD. But this is not a problem, like the mayor said, unique to Rochester. Firearm-related crimes and shootings specifically are up across New York State and most of the larger cities in the country. You can see it's up really dramatically here. This is a rolling 365-day look, which really lets you look at the trends instead of focusing on annual totals, which are highlighted here in the black circles. Essentially what this does is it assumes every day is the end of a year, and it tracks back 365 days and provides a total. So you can see how it ebbs and flows. 2020 obviously is completely outside of where we would expect to be and where we have been historically. We are not, like I mentioned before, unique in New York State, especially. This is a table comprised of all shootings across New York State's GIVE areas. That's a grant that it stands for Gun Involved Violence Elimination. And it's a grant, a collaborative grant that the state provides to the municipalities that are experiencing the highest levels of firearm-related crime outside of New York City. But you can see, compared to some of our similar cities, Buffalo and Syracuse, we are experiencing really, really large changes from a year-to-year standpoint and pretty dramatic ones across the 5-year standpoint. In this table, I'm going to kind of go through it quickly, but it is in the PDF that we provided to council. So really, when we start talking about a crime reduction strategy, our focus is really on firearm-related violent crime. And the executive deputy chief and the deputy chief of operations will go into really the tenets of what we're going to focus our strategies on. But essentially what we do know is even though violent crime is spiking, it's not abnormally different than it was previously. What we know is that firearm-related violent crime clusters both in geographic location and time. And there's a very small percentage of the community that's responsible for a disproportionate amount of offending, right? We have a chronic firearm offender issue, and we have historically hot hotspots. And this is just a visual example of where our hotspots are. The map on the left is essentially a density map of firearm-related violent crime. And you can see that it's obviously the red is the hottest, signifying the most of the offending occurs in that area or victimization. It essentially runs from the northeast in Clinton section to the northwest in Lake section, down to the southwest in Genesee section. It's commonly referred to as the crescent or the fatal crescent. This is probably not news to anybody in this Zoom call, but what I do want to kind of impress upon people is that even though these are general hotspots and they have relatively large coverage when you look at it on a map, we're talking about a very, very small problem. It is a small number of streets, just like a small number of offenders, that disproportionately count for our firearm-related violent crime, which from a police department standpoint is actually a good thing because it's a stable problem that we can address rather than it being a moving target. The shooting density map on the right-hand side is a breakdown of street segments. And just to give you an idea, that's not like North Clinton is a whole street. There's multiple segments across cities, streets like North Clinton. But to give you an idea of perspective, 1% of our street segments account for 1/3 of all of our shootings. 3% account for 60% of all of our shootings. And 9% account for 95% of all of our shootings. So it is extremely concentrated and focused in geography. So you'll see as the chief and the deputy chiefs talk about our plan is strategic and our plan is focused on these areas that we know experience a disproportionate amount of firearm-related violence. So I'm going to turn it over to the chief right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. First of all, I want to start off really giving kudos to my team, my folks, especially our executive deputy chief. He's really hit the ground running. As I've mentioned before, one of the reasons I selected him is that we complement each other and that we both bring separate but strong skill sets to the table. So it's really been great working with him. As I'd mentioned in my 90-day plan, that one of the things I'm looking at is to ensure that we have a tighter alignment or to see where we are and if we need to tighten our alignments with 21st century policing principles. As you know, those are best practices that were put into place in the report that was initiated by President Obama, and that still holds true right now. A lot of work went into coming up with a model that, you know, allows police departments to really garner their efforts towards working more closely with the community and improving practices. Also, a renewed commitment to neighborhood policing model. These are things we know, but we want to make sure that we're where we could improve a little bit or kind of increase our efforts to work within that model, that we want to be able to do that. Often we have programs and policies that we know work, but maybe sometimes our implementation isn't what it could be, and maybe we can do a little bit better. So that's all this is about. It's not about reinventing the wheel. I think there are a few things we do and do well. We just need to get back to the basics. So that's certainly my focus. We talk about implementing evidence-based strategies. Again, some of that we do, but we want to be even more driven by that, where the work's been done that tells us, you know, how to best focus our efforts so that we get the most out of our resources. That's what our practice is going to be and has been moving forward. And, you know, the goal is to problem solve. I know many of you have heard from me probably for years also, since I've been out of policing, is that I believe in trying to fix a problem in the best way so that we don't have to revisit it again, that there's a sustainable solution and we're not constantly putting Band-Aids on something that needs a major surgery. One of the other things that we've done and will continue to do is our partnerships with leaders and subject matter experts, where we can reach out to people where we need their experience and knowledge. We can certainly call on them and bring them to the table. That's another thing, again, that both the executive deputy and I have a bit of experience in. We have got a lot of contacts from around the world in law enforcement. And it's a great family in some ways, because you just have to pick up the phone when that relationship's there and really kind of run some of the problems you've been dealing with by them, and they're more than happy to help. So next slide, please, Nick. Thank you. Again, for the 21st century policing model, there are those 6 pillars. And I won't read them all, but some of those involve you want to build trust and legitimacy with the community. And then there are points under that you would measure your efforts internally against to make sure you're in task with that. But also one of those areas is officer wellness and safety. And as I've said before, and I want to repeat it, is that I need a fully functioning whole police department to be able to help the community. So those things are important too. Their well-being is important as well. So I can't stress that enough. Those are some of the conversations I've had with the Police Accountability Board, the board chair. She's very much supportive of that. So we've had some great conversations about that. And again, looking at how our procedures align with the most up-to-date best practices. We're constantly looking at operations and trying to make sure that we're in alignment with those, and where we're not, you know, how can we improve? What things can we put into place to ensure that we're more so? Because in the end, our department and the community is going to be well served when we're able to do that, because these are proven practices. Next, thank you. When we talk about reducing crime and improving relationships, and we talk about increasing our collaborative relationships and doing problem solving, I've also said this, that it's never been my position as chief to walk into this role that we will come up with a solution and then present it to the community. I see this as a partnership. My command staff sees it as a partnership. We're very much committed to working together because in the end, those things have to have community buy-in or we won't be successful. So we've certainly called our relationships into full use. For those we do know, some we don't, that we've been introduced to, but improving communication is certainly a priority for us. This is something it's a constant, meaning we have to be vigilant about that. There's never a point where we can say, okay, we've done our best, we're in a good place where the communication's good. That has to be ongoing so that we can make sure that we're hearing the voice of the community, because sometimes things change or we don't always have all the answers, and we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to allow them to be heard and to be able to communicate back to them as well as to some of the things that we're working with or dealing with that we may really need their input on. Next, please. So recently we've had a training session, and the executive deputy was key in that. We had talked about the SARA model, that's scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. And this is something I've used for years, even in my previous role at the Rochester Housing Authority for the different initiatives we have in place. And what I like about it is it encourages you to figure out the problem, do an assessment, and see that you have an understanding of what the issues are, and you come up with a solution. But when I talked a little while ago about being vigilant, the assessment part encourages you to come back, see how things are going. Do you need to change or tweak something to be able to get a better outcome? So those are the kinds of things we're teaching to our staff. I had talked to the ED about wanting to do a leadership training for our police officers in the command levels so that people have a good foundation. They understand that when a problem comes to their attention, that we want them to go through certain parts where they're assessing the problem, really trying to come up with a solution. And when we come together, they're prepared to let myself know, to let the executive deputy know what their initial plan is to try to fix that. And certainly we'll work together and maybe tweak or help. But I want everybody with a good foundation on how to manage their areas. And it won't matter where you go in the police department, you can change sections, but everybody is going to have this foundation. So that's something we're going to be working towards. Next, please. So we talked about evidence-based, and you're going to hear that throughout our discussions, that we want those things to drive what we do. And so that when we bring about plans and resources, that there's a good foundation there, that we've done some homework and some research, and that's coming from a position of knowledge, so that when we come and put pieces in place, that there's some strength and a basis to what we're doing. So we want to get into the habit of having those things drive what we do. We talked a bit when we put our anti-violence plan together, or tweaked it, the 2017 model, but those are the pieces that were involved. You've heard from us that the pieces that involve our 21st century policing best practices, that those things are woven into the plan as well. So we want to stick to our basics. We want to, again, have the evidence drive what we do so that we get the best use of our resources. You know, that could be limited in time, let's face it, but we're going to do the best we can, but with what we have. But those things are certainly going to guide us in what we do. And as we're always looking to these sorts of models and resources to see how they operate and what may have changed, that we're on top of the best or the newest information on that. So next, please. So we've already done a little bit of this, had some conversations with some of the people we know that are subject matter experts in different areas. Also, what's involved is the Department of Justice's that Collaborative Reform Initiative. That's their CRITAC Center where they offer training and technical assistance, excuse me, at no charge. So that's something the executive deputy's been working on and taking advantage of resources we have here. Also in my 90-day plan, I talk about putting together an advisory group. Well, that's going to involve not just law enforcement, but also professionals as well, so that when we have questions or need expertise, that they're just a phone call or an email away, and that they're prepared to help and support us in making sure we're driven by the best, most up-to-date information. So then you'll see a little bit about our Project Safe Neighborhoods. There are representatives in this BJA or Bureau of Justice Assistance area that we're prepared to work with as well. What I also like about this is having been on the national board of NOBLE, and that is National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. A lot of these people you get to know, you're friends with, you're having different discussions with. So it's more than knowing who they are, but you've also got a professional relationship that you can cut through and get a hold of them right away and really get a sense of who you should be talking to if there's certain resources that you want to take advantage of. Next, please. So this is a list of some of the points from the 21st century policing. Some of these are actual pillars and some of these are points or recommendations underneath that, but certainly they all make sense. That we want to build trust and legitimacy in the community. That's your first pillar. But when I look at things like extending grace when possible, I think what I like most about this piece is you really get a sense of things that you see an officer do that has a great relationship with the communities, but now there are terms and names to it. So anyway, I look forward to hearing more from the rest of our group, but I'll let the ED take it from here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, and it's certainly an honor to be here to talk about what we're going to do with this violence crime reduction plan. And obviously, it's a long-term plan. And when the chief asked me to come and speak, and more importantly, to be here, she asked me to take a preliminary assessment of the needs that we have. And I can tell you, from what I see, there are some things that we're doing well, some things that we have some challenges, and some things that we're going to improve on. And the first thing talks about leadership. And we're going to speak in terms of how we're going to address leadership by building a bench that allows for us to develop better ways to address our crime control strategies, and also understand how important it is for us to have the appetite to bring in subject matter experts and be able to listen to them and allow them to help guide our efforts in light of the many positive things we're doing here. So our violence reduction plan, long-term, is designed to address our community policing efforts as well as violence simultaneously. Now, when we take a critical look at what's taking place in the Crescent and many areas throughout Rochester, we know that the Clinton section, as well as the Lake section, Clinton section primarily, really makes up about 40% of our crime, while Lake is about 25% of our crime. And while we'll focus on all areas, it is important that we maintain and put in place a community policing response in concert with that violence response in order to address these crimes. But building that bench also allows for us to make sure that our commander and captains are leading the crime control measures. For lack of a better term, these captains that are leading these sections are like the police chiefs in their areas, providing them the resources that they need in order to be successful. And they will be allowed to design tailored and specific problem-solving efforts to address their concerns. You know, and we know that there are different concerns in Goodman than there are in Central or in Lake or in Genesee. The concerns are different in each particular section. That's why we want to make sure that our captains, by way of our commander and the deputy chief, are aware of those concerns and they're able to develop a tailored response. As the chief mentioned, we started off by making sure that we train all of the captains on the forms of traditional policing and the problem-oriented solving matter, which is the method we're using at SARA. So using that, we'll have a mixture of policing strategies that will work using those problem-solving matters to focus on hotspots, to identify our chronic offenders, and to utilize victimology in order to assess how we go about addressing crime. Now that's going to call for us to work in tandem with our community affairs officers. And we've done that on a regular basis, but we want to reinvigorate our stance with respect to how we deal with not only the community members, but our business merchants, getting on the ground, having conversations, talking, meeting, getting the right police officers to collaborate and develop that relationship. Through the neighborhood policing plan, we want to carve out a different response. We feel that it's extremely important for us to forge a relationship with many of our community organizers. Our faith-based community is extremely important. Mothers, other people in the community that we believe we need to make sure we're developing a great relationship with and have them help us build trust and legitimacy. And it starts by listening to them. It starts by getting our crime prevention officers out and carving out a different response that allows for us to get them to work to solve the problems. That means we're going to maximize efficiency with our city government. We already know that the city government itself is creating a lot of avenues in order to bring in jobs, in order to deal with some of the poverty issues. And we know that working with those issues in tandem, we can work in our law enforcement capacity to improve the quality of life for the citizens here. We want to do that, as I indicated, and the chief talked about, is bringing in and leveraging many of the subject matter experts that the chief has gleaned and made contact with through Noble and through many of her national contacts. And I am also reaching out to many of them, and we also have them working in tandem with our efforts free of charge as part of the subject matter experts. But we'll be working with many of our local, state, and federal law enforcement partners. ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the FBI, US Marshals, all of them will be working in tandem with how we take this approach. So more importantly, I'm going to turn things over to Deputy Chief Persons to speak about some of the objectives and strategies. But I do want you to know that really soon you'll see we're going to have a problem-solving meeting. That meeting will allow for us to get all the stakeholders that we feel are important at the table and addressing some of the crime issues that we have and taking a more collaborative approach to problem solving so that we can hold ourselves accountable in order to address crime. With that being said, Deputy Chief of Operations Pearson will take it from here.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come before you and brief you on where we're going with our violence reduction strategies. So violence reduction objectives. Again, as the chief said, utilizing a problem-solving model, SARA, The good thing about SARA is it allows you to assess, as the chief mentioned earlier. That allows you to evolve your plan as crime continues to evolve, or the needs of the community continue to evolve as well. It doesn't keep you stuck in one way of thinking. We're going to use SARA to determine the root cause and identify the areas of occurrence and develop the appropriate response. Again, SARA allows for that appropriate response because it's going to be tailored to each section, and the captains will be using that when they're utilizing and developing their plans for the section. Utilizing our officers, they're assigned to the 5 geographic sections: Lake, Genesee, Goodman, Clinton, and Central, a patrol, and incorporate them into a model of community policing. The biggest part about this bullet is the fact that we're going to be choosing the right officer. You know, it's a concerted effort to get the right officers that work those car beats, to work those neighborhoods, to actually reach out and start building, rebuilding trust with our citizens. Going to work closely with community partners to introduce a problem-solving methods, as the executive deputy chief said earlier, and this is going to aid in the success of our plan. If we're not reaching out to the community to find out and identify what our needs and what their needs and what our problems are, then that's not going to be very collaborative, and it's going to actually cause us issues in the future. Next, thank you. We have developed a viable and sustainable plan. That's the most important part, a sustainable plan for violence reduction that is grounded in the principles of procedural justice and focused on, but is not limited to, early dispute identification and intervention. I think we all know, unfortunately, of a story that has gone bad, where it was a dispute over something that people were just frustrated and acted on it the wrong way, which caused issues. I think with this strategy, we're going to be identifying those disputes before it gets to the shooting, before it gets to the violence part, and working with all the citizens and all of our partners to try and avoid those and intervene ahead of time. Firearm hotspot policing, responding to the hotspots, as Nick Petiti mentioned earlier. We do know, it's very obvious by the map that you were provided, that we have our issues in that fatal crescent, if you will. And in there, knowing that now that we identify the problem, we can actually put resources and have a concerted effort into addressing the firearm violence in those areas. Targeting high-risk firearm offenders. It's a very small portion of the community that have these guns and have and are at high risk for using them against people or citizens in the neighborhoods. Going after them specifically will also help curb our issues with violence. The street outreach and neighborhood policing, it's getting back to, again, community policing, neighborhood policing, being out on the street, being seen, working, just forging relationships with our partners, just looking to have that one-on-one so that we're able to, when you see the police officer walking down the street, you know people by name. You can have that relationship and build trust and legitimacy going from there. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Commander Dave Smith, and he's going to talk about our current operations and our short-term plans that involve the captains responding to violence and issues in their section.
Thanks, Chief. So short-term planning basically involves anything that's not covered in the long-term plans. I know it may sound logical, but so violence is obviously our priority. The long-term plans are designed to hopefully take care of our violence problem. But we all know things come up in the meantime while we're trying to take care of, our long-term plan. And as we all know, what happens is, if we pull resources from the long-term plans, then that's going to jeopardize their success. The bottom line is we need to remember that when we concentrate on everything, we concentrate on nothing. So the short-term planning is when issues come up, we want to address them, but we need to use resources that are not involved in the long-term plans, mostly on duty, or, plain and simple, they're not in the areas where we're doing long-term plans, but there's still areas that need to be addressed. So a lot of times for these, it's, for example, you'll hear the term micro hotspots. It may be an area that just recently, all of a sudden now we have an uptick in crime. We want to take a look at it, see if we can get on top of it, solve it before it does become something that now we're looking at long-term. And the way that's done is the captains and I meet. We actually meet more than on a weekly basis. We meet pretty much every day. But at the end of the week, we look at anything that might have popped up, anything that needs to be addressed. And then at the end of the week, each captain gives me their short-term plan for what they're going to do in the coming week with the issues that they need to deal with in their respective sections, in addition to the long-term plan, which we continue to work on. So it's a multifaceted two-pronged approach. Obviously, we need to stop things as best we can or address them as they pop up. But we also need to make sure that we're not taking resources away from our long-term plans, which ultimately is going to lead to our ultimate success. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, BJ, could you stop sharing as we get ready to take questions and answers? Could you please just stop sharing the screen for a second? Thank you so much. First of all, I want to commend the council members for being able to hold their mule and allow that full presentation to go on without asking any questions. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you, Chief Sullivan, Executive Chief Anderson, Commander Smith, Deputy Chief Persons. I want a point of privilege. I'll start with the first question, then I'll go to Councilmember Harris, and then we'll proceed as accordingly. For years, I have been saying that I believe that we had a containment issue in our city. And when I hear the words like concentrated and stable and small, maintain, and when we hear the numbers that Mr. Petiti brought for us as far as 10%, a third of our third, 3%, 60%, 9%, 90%, and we seem to see that they're normally the same areas that are having this concentrated issues of violence. Two-part question. My first part is, one, how does bail reform, has that exacerbated the issue, or does it create more of a challenge as you strategically plan to combat this concentration of violence? And part two is, since the problem seems to be concentrated, if you will, then does that make it somewhat easier to strategize around these particular hot zones?
Thank you, Councilman Lightfoot. I'm going to take a little stab at the first part, and then if Mr. Bettini doesn't mind kind of weighing in on that part two. Bail reform, something certainly taking a look at and seeing how or in what way it impacts what we do. I've had some staff members looking at actual arrests and release times to kind of see if there's a connection there. So we're still kind of taking a look at that. The data is a little raw that we looked at. And so actually, I gotta let Nick know that's something that I'm gonna be asking you to help take a look at. So, but anyway, certainly there's the potential there, but I'm really not prepared to say to what extent. As you know, I've worked quite a bit on addressing disparity in the justice system, and I certainly believe that we need to make changes so that it's as impartial as a process as possible. But I also believe we have to balance that with the safety of the public. And I've felt that way. I continue to feel that way, but certainly we'll keep you posted on that. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about the other part? Thank you.
Sure. I think from a strategy standpoint, from a data standpoint especially, there are a relatively few number of places that have a disproportionate amount of the crime. That's true. Every one of those places has different reasons for why they're disproportionately affected by crime. So to kind of paint that with a broad brush and say one thing will work, let's say in Clinton section, that'll work again in Thurston, it generally doesn't work out that way, right? They're unique areas, lived neighborhoods that have a lot of different reasons circling around kind of why they have a higher propensity for gun-related violence. Really, what it mostly boils down to locally is really easy access to firearms, and motivated chronic offenders, and essentially an inability to settle interpersonal disputes without using a firearm. We know that a lot of our shooting-related crime, especially, is directly related to interpersonal disputes that are not necessarily crime of passion, right? So the idea that there is time for identification and intervention, actually, that's the focal point of the police strategy, is getting aware of these incidents sooner and getting in the middle of them sooner. When it comes to things like the global pandemic that we're in, it's too early to tell what the actual causal factors are, but I don't think it can be ignored that all the things that we know that reduce firearm-related violence, longer school hours, those are gone. Kids are home from school, right? Access to quality jobs. We had all-time high unemployment. Social outlets. We've lost a lot of the ability to move around. I think all of these things that we know positively affect firearm-related violent crime have kind of been thrown into a bit of an upheaval with this global pandemic. So I don't think we can discredit that. To your point, bail reform, we're going to have to do some analysis on that. It's, again, I know I hate saying this stuff, but it's way too early to tell. It's been in place for about 6 months. And we'd really have to do a hard look at what bail reform set out to do, what would be different about it now compared to previous. I'm sure there's anecdotal evidence to suggest that it's happened on occasion, but as a causal factor, I don't necessarily know that we have any evidence to suggest that that's the reason our violent crime is spiking.
Thank you. Council Member Harris.
Thank
And
you.
then after her, Council Member Lupien.
Thank you, Vice President Lightfoot. And I'd also like to say thank you to Chief Harriet and the command staff and the Mayor Lovely Warren, for this statistical report. I'd like to ask a question, Chief Harriet. What is your margin, or what is the margin of error in your projections that you have listed for 2020?
I'm sorry, part of that was choppy, but you asked about a margin of error, is that right?
Yeah, in the projections that Commander Petty has put out there, I was wondering if there's a margin of error. He had given us some numbers that he's expecting to have, as far as where we will land for 2020 for the violent crime. So I was wondering if there's a margin of error in his projections.
Nick, you want to weigh in? Yeah, because I'm not sure on that, what the percentage is on that.
Yeah, sure. So our percentages are based on an index that we built that takes a look at the last 10 years worth of data, identifies what a normal year or a normal benchmark would look like, and then accounts for normal variation in the data. So what we do when we do the projections is we take all of the data that we have known. So from January 1st to yesterday, we know what that data is. And then we project out the rest of the year based on historical norms for the rest of the time period.
Okay, so there's really no margin of error. It's just based on the previous year's projections.
There's a margin of error, but it's essentially baked into the calculations.
Okay, got it. So my follow-up question is, you also mentioned that we have 19 closed cases for the shootings, and I would like to know, what do you mean by closed? Is it solved, resolved? Can you explain?
Sure. So one of the most common benchmarks that police departments report on are case closures, and in this case, we're talking about homicides. These would be homicide cases that were closed. Homicide events from this year that were closed with an arrest. Obviously, because homicide or murder investigations have no end point, they go on forever. We don't ever close them out. It's not a great measure for static comparisons, right? Because you have 2 or 3 murders that happened recently versus 2 or 3 that happened in January or previous years. They shouldn't carry the same weight, but they often do, and it's a KPI that often gets brought up. So I figured I'd just jump in front of it.
Okay, thank you. So my final question is, you guys also mentioned that that you have neighborhood policing, and it's been mentioned quite a bit. I'd like to know, will the neighborhood policing evolve to us seeing more police on the streets, more than we usually do? Can you tell us a little bit more about what your end game is? What's the goal?
Sure, I'm going to weigh in a little bit, and then I'm going to ask if the ED would weigh in as well. As I've said, that we often hear about that, community policing, and then people think about, what does that mean? And so sometimes that means you may see more, but my bigger focus is on some of the problems that we solve. Do we fix it so that that community person doesn't have to keep dealing with that again? So, like, for example, you had called us, we had a meeting, and you had talked to us about an issue around Chile Avenue area. I just got the ED to stop saying Chile, but he's from out of town. So, we've taken a look at that. He actually drove down there himself and saw for himself some of the issues that community person was talking about. So while she may not have seen him there, but we were able to get to the bottom of some of those things, and it drives what we do in figuring out a way to solve the problem. Similar to that issue in the Bathtub Billy's parking lot. I mean, things like that, really, I just send me in the orbit that, you're in a community neighborhood, people are trying to sleep, they need to go to work the next day, and those are the things they have to deal with. I just really get irritated about that. But ED, do you want to weigh in at all on that as far as the community policing and appearance?
Yes, Chief. I think you hit everything on the head there, and obviously you're familiar with the strategy, and the neighborhood policing is obviously something that's been done in Chicago, Detroit, many other cities, including New York City. But we have a lot of things that we're doing here with our CPOs that will allow for this to be successful. But your question is specifically, will we see more police officers on the street? That is the plan. But really what's more important is the quality of the police officers and the contact. Not police officers just saturating the area and patting people down and talking to them. But we're building a contingency of police officers now that are preparing to go get the training so they can come back and explain to us what the staffing looks like, how the protocol should work, and how we get the right people to do that. And that's the information that I'll be providing to the chief so that the chief can make some decisions with respect to how we deploy the neighborhood policing plan. But yes, seeing more police officers out there is certainly something we want to do, is seeing them in the community, talking to the business merchants and other folks in a positive way is the platform.
Thank you. That concludes my questioning. I would like to give way to my colleagues on council.
Councilmember Lupien, then Councilmember Gruber and Melendez. In that order, please.
Chief Harriet, thank you so much for that presentation. I know a lot of work went into that, and I appreciate all of the motivations behind the work that you're discussing. I hear I've heard a couple of narratives around the spike in crime. One, that it's being caused by the protesters taking away officers from the patrol, and two, that it's potentially bail reform. But seeing as how this data, it's not just Rochester, it's around the country. I would think it's more related to kind of what studies have shown to be root causes of crime. Like in Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he really goes through some studies around employment being linked to violent crime. And neighborhoods with the lowest employment have highest rates of violent crime. And being that we're in a pandemic, where unemployment is off the charts and all kinds of other, like Mr. Petiti mentioned, all kinds of other indicators are being affected. It seems like, I guess, and this isn't necessarily a police department issue, right? But I'd like to hear more talk around, as a city, like how are we going to attack those root causes of crime? And, you know, we know enforcement is, you talked about in your report, it's like the last stand against crime, right? But we have all these things to address before it gets to that point. And so, you know, it'd be interesting to see like an overlay of the charts that you showed, Mr. Petiti, you know, how those other indicators are stacking up. And I probably wouldn't be surprised to see them correlated. Wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually I do. This is just such a complex issue that at times, and what drives those sorts of things. So I'm certainly not laying claim to what the actual causes are, because I know how that sort of thing has an impact. And as Mr. Petiti had talked about the COVID aspects and COVID itself and how it's impacted our community, we've yet to really see, you know, how that's interconnected and what roles it played. Certainly, have seen a bit of a background on, you know, issues like unemployment. I wouldn't doubt that if when we look at that crescent area, and when I was here before, there was a crescent, but it was the other shape, and it included Goodman. So to get back here and see the change in that northeast, you know, the lake section area, we call it, was, you know, a bit of an eye opener for me. So, for example, many of you may be familiar with the Ban the Box initiative, where you had to, well, that was, I've got my signed poster. I was on that committee and believed strongly in that, because, and to me, that was just a common sense issue, because if people get out and they have no way to feed themselves or their families, I mean, what do we think is going to happen? And I know that in some areas, some issues, certain services, because you had that conviction, you would not qualify for those. And so I'd be sitting at the table and I would ask, well, how are they supposed to eat? And so I'm a realist that we can't have people coming out and leave them with no means for self-support. I mean, we just have to. And like I said, I believe strongly in that. I worked on the task force where we, you know, rewrote the code of conduct for the school district. But the drive for me there was because when I saw the data and looking at how once kids are suspended, that the chance that they're going to then, you know, end up in the justice system, I mean, the connections there are strong. So, and when I talk about wanting to fix a problem, not putting a Band-Aid on something that requires surgery, those are the things that I'm referring to. If we know those things, if we know that we don't do something about suspensions, especially if we can look at that and you see that if it disproportionately impacts children of color, then we have to fix that. We have to do something about it. I believe, you know, when you do certain things wrong, you know, you've got to own that, and you may end up getting arrested. But at the same time, if we see that there are issues, community issues that the police don't control, that we need our partners to help work with us to fix those things, then we have to do that. I mean, we look at things like the programs like Food Link, and I've got to tell you that for me, it's not just what I know that they would do in Rochester, but when you see those pictures of the miles, 3 lanes of people waiting just to get food, and I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but as you can tell, I'm passionate about those things. I believe we've got to hold people accountable for certain things when they break the law. But I also believe if it's obvious that there are certain things that contribute to that, and we haven't went on our means to work on those areas and fix it, then I think we have an obligation to do that. But we don't have to do them in silos. I mean, we can do that by working together in partnerships. So I believe strongly in that, and I will continue to.
Yeah, it's really great to hear you talk about partnerships like in that way, and to break down the silos, because that's definitely an issue that we suffer from here. My other question is around like focusing on the hotspots. And I know like in my neighborhood, you know, my corner, it will have issues, and then the police will come and kind of like sit there, and then the issue will go away, but it doesn't go away, it just moves. And so like, yeah, so how is the addressing the hotspots, how can you ensure that it will adjust the problem and not just kind of shift it to another corner?
I'm going to ask the executive deputy to respond to that, because he's playing a pivotal role in that. So go right ahead.
Thank you, Chief and Councilmember Rett. That is a challenging question. I know that one of the things that we've looked at through Nick Patiti is actually looked at crime over a 30-year period. And quite frankly, some of it has been in the same areas over time. So I think the answer to that is it's going to take a collective effort. Many of the things that you're doing with council and the leadership in terms of helping to carve out a better quality of life, jobs, the creation of opportunities for individuals in certain segues of the community is one part of it. And quite frankly, there's a piece where there are some people, and it's a small number of people that are committing crimes on a regular basis. And those that are doing that, those chronic offenders will require the police department to identify them and get them away from we have a victim-oriented response. So we have to make sure that people are not being victimized. But it does take a balance of us identifying the individuals and working with the plan that you all have. I know that Commander Smith, Chief, I don't know if we have time to maybe have him weigh in, but I think that he has some information with respect to what he thinks on that as well.
Thanks, Chief. Yeah, and I mean, it's always been one of our downfalls is, we move resources into an area, we displace it, and then we think, okay, the problem's solved and we moved on. Well, part of the solution has to be, how are we going to maintain it? When we get ready to leave, what community resources can we get in there to help maintain it? What other things can be done? And again, it's a history of chasing dots, which is something that we really need to get away from. We need to look at solving the entire problem and then finding a way to sustain what we've achieved before we leave.
All right, Councilmember Lupien, are you okay? You good?
I do have another question, but I'll hang on till the end.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Gruber, and then Melendez.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to keep it brief, although it's probably a hard question to answer in short order. But I really appreciate the presentation and all the data that is associated with it. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of the SARA model, which is something I've heard about in other parts of in other fields as well. And I think what's challenging for me to wrap my head around is that something like SARA and all this data is really encouraging a long kind of strategic, methodical approach. And so much of what we know is caught up in law enforcement is quick reactions and quick responses. And you're getting a call for service, and you're going to address the call for service, and you have to make quick snap reactions. And I just want to kind of understand, Chief and EDC, if you can give me a sense of how you plan to actually weave in all this data and all this decision-making process into the actual culture of call response. And on top of that, how will we know when that's successful, if you will?
Sure, I'll jump in and then I'll let the ED weigh in as well. But the maps you see really are our calls. That tells us where people are going, what they're responding to, those areas. And if we think about it, it's that 80-20 rule again. You've got a certain segments that are, really responsible for a good chunk of where the resources go. So while initially we may have our people responding to different calls, but on our end, we're looking at those calls. Mr. Petiti's folks are looking at those calls as well. And we start to see, you'll see a pattern of, where are people going? Where are resources being utilized? And what are the problems or the issues? And so our goal and plan is to address those. We can't always know in an evening, that our folks are going to certain calls and we maybe immediately have a grasp as to what's behind that. We're not always going to know that, but if we're paying attention, that we know that. That's how we know, for example, that we look at the kids who are suspended, to what levels, and what happens down the road, because those things inform your research. And when we talk about having a good foundation about what drives what you do, it's based on seeing those patterns of behavior and the connections. And at the at the end of the day, when we sit around the table and we look at that information, because we meet regularly and get those regular reports from the Mr. Petiti's staff, which are very, very, very helpful. We have to let those things inform us, because if I learned nothing else really in the time I've been out of policing, even in other areas and businesses, is that people tend to be consistent as you get into patterns of how you do things and behavior, and those things don't change drastically. So it informs what we look at and how we want to deploy resources in the things we do. ED, do you want to weigh in at all?
Yes, Chief, and I agree. And this is really a good question. You talk about how this is going to really get into the culture, and then how do we know it works? And so, as the Chief talked about, without going into SARA completely, what's critical about it is the first thing is teaching the culture to understand that as they go to these calls and respond to them on a regular basis, the method requires them to try to identify the root problem. So when you have routine calls and you're going to them on a regular basis, we need to assess it, analyze it, find out not what's on the surface, but teaching our police employees to solve the problem. And in doing that, you develop that response, as we talked about. And sometimes the response will require the police officers and get them in a regimen of looking outside the traditional police response. So when you're looking at how we're addressing it, we may reach out to some of our community partners. We may reach out to other resources to help develop a response. That's what makes it different. And these are things that you can do relatively quickly. But that last part is when you talk about measurement. And as I think I indicated, we're having a problem-solving meeting. That meeting is designed to get everyone together, many of us, to talk about the problems and how we solve them. But that assessment piece is having a real conversation about whether or not what you did worked. It's the measurement piece. It's admitting that you tried something and it did not work, or you tried something and it did work in Lake, and should we utilize the same plan in Goodman? So it forces us to start thinking strategically, communicating strategically, but also still having a quick and fast response to issues that are occurring on a regular basis. And that's how that works, Councilman.
And I would just add to that, the part that you won't see is that when it does come to us, that we're asking the question, how do you plan to address this? If you come to us with the problem, then we're going to be asking you, our leaders, how do you plan to address it? If you need help, let us know. We'll work with you. That's why we're here. But the days of coming to your boss and saying, hey, well, I've noticed a problem over here. You may want to have somebody take a look at that. No, that's not how it's going to work. We expect our people to be problem solvers, but we're going to give them the skills and support to be able to do that.
Thanks.
Councilmember Melendez. We can't hear you, Councilmember.
How about now?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you, Vice President. So I've done a lot of work around hotspot policing and data-driven analysis, community-based crime reduction. And I'm familiar with the SARA model. So I think all of the direction that was mentioned today, it's a great direction to go in. One of the things that I feel we have to have a deeper conversation about, and this isn't just for law enforcement, is really community trauma, especially around. I think that there's, over a period of decades, been a concentration of adverse experiences, often shared experiences in specific neighborhoods, those hotspots that we're talking about. And it's had a psychological impact on our community at large. I think people have shifted the mentality over time to, it's almost culture to say, well, I'm going to shoot or I'm going to get shot, in certain circumstances. And because that's been cultured, we really have to identify the fact that this has been learned. I mean, people have become more desensitized to gun violence. And so I guess my question is around how do we expand the broad base of knowledge around this issue? How do we increase the number of angles that we attack this problem? Because it's really a public health issue. It's a matter of economics, education, engagement in the community. And it's not just law enforcement based. I think that there's a wide range of folks in the community that have a say in this that I think could also have an impact on it. And I'm hopeful that we can find ways to support people through their pain and have conversations with young people. I know that DRISE has, pathways. We have SOY at ABC. And then My Brother's Keeper initiative is something that's working in the schools now. So I just would want to be a conduit to trying to figure out how we have the broader based conversation and what law enforcement thinks about that.
Sure, great question. I believe, and I'm looking forward to the this crisis response model that Dr. Torres's group is going to be spearheading. I'm looking forward to the role that they will play. Certainly, I've been able to see behind the scenes some of the work that those folks have done, even where I've had to, interview young people, and some of the facet people I'd have in the room with me that were just a lifeline, and being able to talk to kids and explain and walk me through some of the things they're dealing with. And then I still have, memories of some of the things I've seen, some of the tough things I've really seen, and leaving there wondering, are those young kids going to be okay based on some of the terrible things they've had to see? How can you not be impacted by it? My challenge has been to really try to focus on getting the partners on board so that they're in the conversation, and really letting that drive me, if you will, because it's, I want to help everybody. The idea of young children, moving forward after dealing with something so tragic and then not having anybody recognize that and help walk them through that. That's, those are things that really just stay with me. They haunt me to this day, quite frankly. But when we talk about partnering and, working with our experts on the areas that they're strong in, I believe in staying in my lane. And some of the things we talked about, like, for example, in our staff meetings, are when we look at groups like Clergy Response and and Rise Up Rochester and these other groups, we know they have a role to play. And they're doing it many of them out of the goodness of their hearts, because they love this community and they want to work with us. So I'm all for bringing them to the table and using whatever resources we can. And certainly am open to any support or suggestions that anybody here might have, even from some of the community members. The other issue for me is I hope that we can really try to, and by that I mean us as a community, keep things in context. So, so if we see kids, maybe like we've seen some children that they might come to school and they have weapons. And rather than as a law enforcement agency that we deal with the weapons piece only, but might it be that somehow they've been through some tragedy or trauma and they're afraid? And do we even ask that question? You know, those are the things I want to get to is, you know, depending on the circumstance, it's, you know, we don't know what may need to be done, but why would you at 11 years old feel you need that weapon? Can we at least ask the question and then be prepared so that if there's something they've been dealing with or they're afraid of, then you can deal with it then. You can stop it then before it grows into something else. So I'm of that mindset. I think our only challenge is going to be getting enough resources so that we have somewhere to plug people in when we're dealing with things like that.
Thank you, Chief. Councilmember P.O. Patterson Evans, feel free to chime in.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time, Chief. I know this is a very tough job for you all, I'm sure. And I really believe that it's going to take a sandwich effect. It needs to be, you know, the city coming in and helping to make sure that people don't turn to that life of crime. But at the same time, you know, you guys have said multiple times that it tends to be the same people over and over again. And I really believe that it's not, there seems to be this idea that poor people are out there shooting each other when really it's, from what I've seen living in that life, it's not poor people shooting each other. It's people that are making a lot of money a day shooting each other that want to keep making a lot of money a day. All right. So I want to clear that up real quick. There are people out there who are just bad people who need to be held accountable for their actions. Number two, a lot of the things that we're seeing, especially in certain areas, is the people who keep making the same mistakes over and over again, who aren't held accountable for their actions. They keep going out there, breaking into houses, stealing, going into people's, you know, yards, taking equipment and stuff like that. I understand that we want to have, you know, we want to treat people with dignity, respect and such, but there's some people who I know, I've seen them. Sometimes they need to get yoked up a couple of times to learn to stay off drugs, stay off the alcohol, stay off the bottle, and be held accountable for their actions. So I want to make sure we understand there are things that'll help people to stay away from that stuff, but we need the police to hold them accountable as well. That's my point of view. You can speak to that if you want, but I just want to make sure I get my voice.
No, I can understand your point. I would agree. And even, you know, I might invite Mr. Battiti in a minute if you want to maybe talk a little bit about what drives some of those things, acts of violence we're dealing with. He talked a little bit about it, but no, I believe that, you know, we've got to hold people accountable. I believe strongly in that. But my point is that if after a while we start to see what's driving certain actions, whatever that is, then I think we have to try to address that. I think we have an obligation to the public that if we see patterns of behavior that we can take action to address, and at the end, that's going to mean that the folks in our community are going to be safer, then I think we have an obligation to do that. So when I worked at the National Drug Court Institute in Washington, D.C., that was justice driven. So you take people who've got addiction issues that are committing crimes of different types, and you still have to get arrested and held accountable for it. But what happens then is you take that and you say, okay, do you want to continue to be arrested, or are you facing some time? or do you want to deal with your addiction and then do something about that? So that's why I liked that that model, and why I enjoyed my work there, is that there was still the accountability. You held people accountable, but you also gave them an opportunity to fix it so they can get off the addiction, obviously, and then, you know, stop the revolving door.
That's perfect.
So
No, I completely agree with that, because I know some people who, you know, the best thing that could have happened for them was to get
yes,
arrested, get
getting
cleaned
arrested.
cleaned up, get a job, get that self-respect for themselves, and then never turn back to that. And that's all I'm saying. That's perfect.
Perfect story. That's all I'm looking for.
Okay, hold on, I'm sorry,
No,
Chief. I'm
go
gonna
right ahead.
try to capture Councilmember Patterson, Evans. We're well over our time. We normally have an hour for these work sessions, but this is such an important topic to the council members and to this community that I'm letting us really dive into this, but I'm gonna hold us to no later than like 4:45. But I want to capture everyone's questions. Councilmember Patterson, Councilmember Evans, then we're going to loop back around to no point intended, to Councilmember Lupien, and then we're going to wrap up. Okay. So Councilmember Patterson.
No questions at this time.
Councilmember Evans.
No, just briefly, just a brief comment. I don't know, Mr. Petiti, you know, I think young people always get a bad rap in communities across the country. In terms of the data that you have there, what's the age range of perpetrators of folks that we've caught in terms of violence as it relates to gun crime? Are the majority 18 and older, or are they younger? For example, say last year or the year before.
Yeah, a vast majority of our firearm-related offenders are older than 18.
Yeah,
generally in their mid to late 20s.
Yeah, I mean, because I think a lot of these folks that are, I think just the point needs to be made that a lot of these folks are grown people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not kids. They're not teenagers. So I think that's an important point that we have to remember. And then the second point I want to make is that I think, and I hope the chief can kind of answer this question, is how are we making sure that we don't lose sight of the victims and people who have lost people to violent crime? I'm thinking of 3 individuals I know personally family members who are dead now in a cemetery. They were shot in the back of the head, literally, all 3 of them, over the last 10 years who are dead. And their perpetrators are still at large. They left children behind. Their families are still suffering. One person in particular lost 2 sons to violent crime, killed in a similar manner. How do we make sure that we don't lose sight of that piece? I'm all for root causes. I as a young person, I started out youth development, Rochester Challenge Against Violence. I'm against all that. I think we need to look at root causes. But there are people who have lost loved ones to violent crime, and they're not interested in hearing about the issues that the person that killed them might have been going through. That's important. We need to deal with that. But how do we make sure that we don't lose sight of the victims? And when I say the victims, not just those that are dead and in the cemetery, but also their families, the loved ones that they lost behind, who are going through a traumatic experience of the perpetrators of these crimes, still out here on the street. They could be behind us in Wegmans or in the library with us. How do we strike that balance, Chief?
Good points. I think that, and first of all, as you remember, Mr. Evans, you and I met when you first started in teen court, and that was,
That's right.
Yeah, exactly, experience. And I told you I expected to see you doing great things. So, well, aside from dating myself, here you are. That's exactly what you're doing. So, yeah, my position on getting at root causes actually are very passionately driven by victimization. Meaning, if the things that our families have gone through, who've lost loved ones, I want to get to a place where we either see a lot less of that or we don't see it at all. But certainly for us, and by that I mean in law enforcement, we believe strongly in making sure that our victims are are supported, that what they're going through is addressed. Like, for example, when you're familiar with the Fernwood, not Fernwood, I'm sorry, back up the public market, that mass shooting that they
Right,
had.
right,
Yeah, well, we
right.
had a press conference where we were talking to try to drum up support for people that would come forward and maybe talk about what had happened or if they'd seen something. But when we talked about this a little bit behind the scenes before we went out in public, and we had time to talk with and support the families. One of those victims was a friend of my nephew's, and certainly we want to make sure that it was clear to them that we felt really badly for what they'd gone through, and we were there for them. That's why we were there. So much so that I had to instruct our major crimes unit that, because I hadn't been in the job that long, and there was still some focus there. But I told them I don't want to answer any questions about me. I want the focus to be on those families and what they've been dealing with and how we're trying to help them. So, but I want you to know, I believe very strongly that if I see patterns of behavior that impact how whether a person who's been victimized can go to the store without being terrified, I'm going to be all over that because I feel very strongly about it. I talked about Councilwoman Harris is having, her constituents come to her. I mean, that woman not being able to sleep or the noise, those things, are very important to us. They're quality of life issues. It really impacts how people live every day. And those things are a priority to us. And you've seen that woman throughout our plan. We we talk about root causes, but at the end of the day, we want a community where people can thrive and go about their lives without going through a lot of difficulty. So that's always going to be a priority to us.
Are you good, Councilmember Evans?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, our final questions coming from Councilmember Lupian. Take us away.
I see really twin issues. One being, violent crime, and the other, the fear of violent crime, right? And actually being carried out, but then also the fear of police in the community, and incidents of misconduct that have weakened trust with the force from the community. And I see an emphasis on respect and dignity and grace, but it's something that I don't see a lot of, I guess. And I have certain specific interactions, like I being at the protests and hearing from people who are at the protests, and also when things happen in the community, I don't usually get the good reports, right? I only hear about the bad ones. But even reading about the case of, I think it was Mr. Simmons who was shot in the back, reading about how that incident went down. There needs to be a lot of work done in that area. And I'm just wondering how you're planning on going about making sure that the personal interactions that officers have with this community are conducted with respect and dignity.
Sure. First, we want to start with our value systems, and we want to reemphasize how what we expect from our officers, but also at the same time, we want to support them, and that those that are doing things the way they should be done, if there are issues, then we would need to deal with that as well. I mean, so for example, like I've been meeting with quite a few folks, and some of the recent meetings I've had are with, some of the people who are involved in protests. And I've shared some things with them, like I've had videos showing that officers have had live commercial grade fireworks thrown at them. And it really, just in looking at it, is really scary, horrifying. It had the potential to really start some large fires that really hurt somebody. And so, but at the same time, I'm not holding the entire group of protesters accountable for the actions of those folks. Mm-hmm. So, but at the end of the day, we've got to come together and be able to talk to each other. I've had 2 meetings. I've got one more this week, and then in the middle of setting up another with some of the people who are part of the key organizers, because there are legitimate concerns on both sides. And then we have to be able to come together, be transparent with each other, and really talk about how we're going to be able to move forward. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you, like the executive deputy mentioned, that we're looking at how we're doing things, and certainly we have some challenges, we do. But as I've said, I'm a realist, and some of the videos I've seen and pictures. But you also should know that to the extent that these things have been brought to our attention, I've certainly shared with our executive deputy, and he's brought our command staff involved in it. Those things are acted on immediately, and we talk to people. But it puts me in a tough spot to hold the officers accountable when they're wrong, or if they've done something or said something they should. But if I see evidence where, like I said, in those cases, I'm talking about extreme examples where somebody could have seriously been hurt, and I'm not sure how they weren't, but I have to address that as well. So, but certainly no, we'll be as transparent as we can, that we expect a certain response from our people to be professionals, but at the same time, if they're doing things the right way, then we have to have their backs as well. So that's, I hope that's helpful.
I understand. And the people that are doing those things, they're some of them are brought up on federal charges, like the department has the surveillance equipment to be able to identify people. But on the other side, there's like a power imbalance, where people that are having real serious, disrespect or misconduct, they don't even know what officer it was because they can't see their badge number in the dark and their name is covered up. And so it's leading to just real, people feeling like they're being followed home from protests and just a fear, which I know you already know, but it's just, I guess, to underscore that there's a power imbalance in making sure that people are held accountable for what they do.
Well, feel free to reach out to me offline about that. We can certainly talk a little bit about it. I think I'd mentioned before, I'm not sure, but that we were having instances where officers were having certain protesters that would Google their names, find out where they lived. And during the protest, literally, they were having people go to their homes and harass their families. So, but, that's not the answer either. But like I said, I'm looking for the level-headed people that we can have discussions with to come to an understanding about how we can work through this and, support the rights of our protesters to peacefully protest. But at the same time, where officers are conducting themselves in the way they should be, then we've got to support them as well. That's what I want to get to. That's my goal.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Lupien. I think that's a good note, Chief, to end on, that we all have to continue to work together. I want to, on behalf of Council President Loretta Scott and City Council and the citizens of Rochester, I want to thank Mayor Lovely Warren. I want to thank the Chief Harriet Sullivan. I want to thank Executive Deputy Chief Anderson, Commander Smith, Deputy Chief Persons, Chief of Staff Wells, and all of you that were listening. We have a lot more work to do. We understand that. I don't think anybody's shying away from that. I think this administration, as well as this particular chief and her administration, are open for that challenge. We have the Race Commission going in tandem with Rumor Hill, who's now doing a deeper dive, along with the working group that's working alongside with the chief and the mayor and administration, Wilmer Hill, Race Commission. There's a lot going on right now. It's going to be a lot of community engagement, a lot of opportunity for us to begin to build and take deep dives into the challenges of civil unrest, looking to get justice for all of our citizens, as well as supporting our officers, because not all officers are bad, and we understand that. So we want to make sure that we have a balance, as was said before, and we're going to work diligently to make sure we do that. A lot of this information has been shared with us. Some of the numbers are staggering and sobering, as the mayor has said. It's happening across the country, but the good news is that we have a good team that's willing to take on the challenge and make sure that we have a safer Rochester and a better quality of life for all of our citizens. So I'm going to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, have a good afternoon. Stay safe, wear your mask, wash your hands, protect your circle, physical distance, and all that good stuff. All right, God bless you.